Well, welcome to episode 425 of an AI-free 10-minute record reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record which came out on Riverside in 1956. It's called Get Happy with the Randy Weston Trio. This is Randy Weston's first 12-inch long player, having released a couple of 10-inch records for Riverside in the preceding year and a half. It must be said that compared to his 1960s work or even his late 50s work, this record is for Weston fairly conventional, but it does begin to show his increasing comfort with a wide variety of styles, and despite its more rigid format, reveals the leader to be technically skilled and to have expansive musical tastes, and so it really gives you the impression of a butterfly about to flap its wings. Randy Weston was born in April 1926 in Brooklyn. His father was from Jamaica via Panama, and his parents owned a restaurant. His dad was an ardent follower of the black nationalist, the Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, and he passed on a lot of that consciousness, that Pan-African consciousness, to his son Randy. Young Randy's initial musical training was in classical piano, and he also got a lot of exposure to the music of the church, courtesy of his mother. He studied music at Boys High School in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and on graduating in 1944, he was just in time to get drafted. He was in the Army from 1944 to 1947 in a segregated unit. His last year of posting was to Okinawa. When he came back to Brooklyn in 1947, he helped the family run the family restaurant, which was called Trios. And it was kind of a meeting place as well as a restaurant. It was a meeting place for musicians, intelligentsia, and through the restaurant and through working there, Randy gets exposed to all kinds of people that regular folks just wouldn't bump into. In terms of his early influences in the 1930s, he'd been a big fan of Duke, of Basie, of Art Tatum, and he was actually a cousin of Win Kelly, who of course would go on to play with Miles. But really the shining star in his firmament was Thelonious Monk. Monk was a fairly regular diner at the restaurant, and young Randy got to know him. In fact, he used to drive him from Manhattan over to Brooklyn. And while you could never accuse such a unique musician as Randy Weston of being a mimic, it is Monk's influence, his pleasing strangeness, his irreverence, which you can hear most clearly, certainly in the early playing of Randy Weston. Weston leaves the restaurant business and gets involved in music full-time around 1948, working with bands on the R&B circuit, including those led by Bull Moose Jackson, Frank Cully, and Eddie Cleanhead Vinson. His first recordings are made with Cully, possibly in January '49, on a couple of tracks called The Snap and Coleslaw, although he's uncredited, but he definitely is credited on recordings made in 1951, which produced Cauliflower and I've Got You Under My Skin. So he was making some progress, albeit minor. But he could also see, from his vantage point at the restaurant and also in the clubs, the impact that drugs, particularly heroin, had on the jazz scene. And he also had, I guess, loftier ambitions in being in a traveling R&B band. So he decides to leave New York and to move up to Lenox, Massachusetts in 1951, which of course is where the famous Music Inn, jazz retreat, and general kind of musical think tank was held every summer. And it was at Music Inn that he studied with the jazz historian Marshall Stearns and also immersed himself in learning about the African roots of jazz. Recall, of course, that his dad was a Pan-Africanist, so this was a natural interest for Randy. And he didn't just work with musicians either. He worked with a broad variety of artists and intellectuals, including the dancer Jeffrey Holder, the percussionist Babatunde Olatunji, the poet Langston Hughes, and the musicologist Willis James, all of whom he credited with educating him on the Black American experience in global perspective. And by 1952-1953, he knew that what he wanted to do was make self-consciously African music, jazz, but self-consciously African jazz. That said, he wasn't exactly operating from a position of strength. He hadn't established himself as a recording artist yet, and this being the early 1950s, he still had to operate within the chalk lines of the American music industry. So he had to wait, and back to New York he went. In 1953, he played with the influential trumpeter Kenny Dorham, and then with the baritone sax player Cecil Payne, but he didn't record with either of them. In 1954, he starts forming his own small groups, and his very first record, a 10-inch record for Riverside called Cole Porter in a Modern Mood, comes out that year. And that record is significant, not just for Weston, for whom it was his first record, but also for Riverside Records, because this was their first ever modern jazz record. Prior to that, they'd just been producing greats of the swing era. On the Cole Porter record, Weston is accompanied only by his regular bassist, Sam Gill. The follow-up, also a 10-inch for Riverside called the Randy Weston Trio, sees Weston and Gill accompanied by, in my view, a fairly subdued Art Blakey. That record was well received and acclaim soon followed, with Weston being voted a new star in Downbeat's 1955 critics poll. Hot on the heels of that newfound fame comes this record, which, as I'll discuss, shows Weston exhibiting a little more unconventionality, the keyboard. And his trajectory becomes increasingly his own after that and less constrained by the interest and influences of record labels. The big change to my ears happens in 1958 when he leaves Riverside and makes records for United Artists, Roulette, and Colpix. These include Little Niles from 1958, Uhuru Africa from 1961, and Music from the New African Nations in 1963. In all of these, he's stretching out considerably from his previous sound, and in the last of those, he's making explicitly African music. As part of all this, he was a major figure in the United Nations Jazz Society, the remit of which was to foster jazz connections between the United States and other countries, in his case, particularly African nations. On this journey, he benefited from a long-lasting musical partnership with the trombonist and arranger Melba Liston. The first record they worked together on is Little Niles in 1958. Weston's basic idea, which was well underway in application by the early 1960s, was that jazz had its essential origins in African music, which was contrary to the prevailing wisdom that it was basically an exclusively American art form. And not that my view matters, but I think he's right about that, and you can make the same argument, I think, about Latin music as well. And I think I would also say that unlike a lot of musicians who purport to be channeling the African roots of jazz in their music, Weston never falls back on, the trope of extemporizing over this extended, super hypnotic, repeated groove. In fact, he never really settles in one place for very long, which one might find frustrating or fascinating. This record was made in 2 separate sessions on August 29th and 31st, 1955, at Rudy Van Gelder's home studio in Hackensack, New Jersey. The producer was Orrin Keepnews, although Bill Grauer also gets a credit. I think that's probably just corporate. Weston is on piano with Sam Gill on bass and Wilbert Hogan on drums. Sam Gill has a somewhat unusual CV. He gets the nod for being a new star on bass from Downbeat's critics in 1955. When he gets his MA in 58 or 59, he gets an offer from the Colorado Symphony Orchestra, and he drops the jazz world entirely, heads out to Denver, and plays with the orchestra for the next 48 years. The drummer, Hogan, was a prolific sideman, and he's also, interestingly enough, the subject of a rather intense debate on Discogs as to whether, in fact, he's 2 people. And accordingly, there are 2 separate entries for him on Discogs, with a stern admonition on both pages not to confuse the 2, and it's in bold, just in case you didn't get the point. Personally, I'm skeptical that it is 2 people because both of them happen to have recording credits with Randy Weston within about a 3-year period, but I have learned not to wade into the deep waters of confirmation bias. Side 1 starts with Get Happy, that old chestnut, and the head arrangement has a series of thundering block chords on piano which seem more Get Ominous than Get Happy, but overall the feeling of the track is light and energetic. The next track is Fire Down There, an interesting arrangement here because this is usually played as a kind of brash up-tempo piece. This is the introverted version. Where Are You is a lovely ballad, and that's followed by Under Blunder, which is the first Weston original. The final track on side 1 is Dark Eyes. One of the challenges on a trio record, I find, is the danger of sameness as the record wears on. There's absolutely no danger of that on this record, and listening to this last track on side 1, I found myself totally impressed by his stylistic and emotional range. Side 2 starts with one of the more unusual takes you'll hear of Gershwin's classic Summertime. It's usually played in kind of a bittersweet, melancholy way, but this is downright jaunty. Next is Bass Nose, another Weston original with Gill's bass, as you might expect, to the fore. A nice track, although the bass solo I don't think is anything particularly special. Next is Duke's C-Jam Blues, and the band acquits themselves quite well. Weston also shows a bit of a monk-like flex in picking out the odd jarring note. That's followed by a ballad, the aptly chosen title of the sole composition by Sam Gill on the record. And they close their tour of styles with 12th Street Rag, which was a pre-war ragtime standard made famous in 1927 by Louis Armstrong's Hot Sevens. At the end of the day, Randy Weston was never going to make his mark in the jazz world by playing standards. His contribution was more profound, excavating the links between America and Africa in the development of jazz and in pushing the boundaries of what was possible. However, the fact that on this record he's not just trying to bang out pleasing versions of old standards is what makes it interesting. The monk influence is strong, and he's trying to say something different on every track. It doesn't all come off, but it's an intriguing record, particularly when you think about where he was headed in the future. It's an enjoyable listen, and I give it 3.5 out of 5 stars.